the haunting question always before us, with or free speech, especially before us Americans. Where is it leading us? To what end? So maybe it's not just Americans, but I think it's especially the Americans in this presentation will focus on the American history with respect to the question, and then also attempt to make some kind of phenomenological avenue of invasion to the question as well. But of course in Moldova right now and in the states around Ukraine, there's a constant war raging over whether there's, how's this stated? I wrote it down here. There's questions of whether we're to understand dissemination of information as being occurring, or some kind of Russian brainwashing or something like that. So in the old language, I take it from a Catholic source, the safeguarding and protection of faith and morals is in question. This is why the censorship would have to come in. So we have this situation where, in Moldova, it seems to be, or at least what the sort of Eastern European sources say, is always something along the lines of that there has to be that what the NATO land message is coming through, what the Ursula von der Leyens and the Mark Rutte's are saying, and the people that are laboring under, from a philosophic point of view, we could have our sort of authoritative statement from The Red Line Dilemma by Habermas. Habermas, Zizek is still described as the state philosopher. He's approaching 100 years old. And basically it said there's total pacification of the population as a way of life, in the sense that 90% of the population says we won't go to war for any reason, in Germany, for instance. And therefore, if their way of life is challenged by war, then this is the red line dilemma. There might have to be a change in the whole ethos. This is not really the ethos of liberalism per se, it's the ethos of some specific form of liberalism, which was under discussion between, for instance, Schmidt and Leo Strauss in the 1932 essay on the concept of the political, and Strauss's criticism of that. But what they say is there has to be disinformation campaigns have to be cracked down on, and then the opposite of that is, well, wait a minute, wasn't there supposed to be this universal notion of free exchange of information? So which one? But so let's put that aside for now. So I find this subject matter is so diffuse and so gigantic of the question of free speech. I totally despair of doing that much with it, except that the more I learn about it, the more I despair about it, but the more I also think I'm right on the edge of kind of giving it some kind of essential treatment. If only I could collate it aptly enough. So I would try to. So let me read something that somebody wrote in. Obviously, the locus classicus is 399 BC. Socrates executed by the democracy for speech which was said to corrupt the youth. So that sounds maybe more like a question of the protection of faith and morals than it does of cracking down on disinformation campaigns. But somehow there's in a way, a connection between this and that's a way of looking at the history of free speech is from that locus classicus of Socrates down through the Catholic time up to, let me just list a few things rapidly, just that one can look into further and get the details, and maybe I'll make some mistakes on it, but I think there were some, before Hollywood brought in the Hays Code, like in 1930 or so, there had been for 60 years or so some censorship laws that were rather broad and which sort of ended in 1933. But I think when the Hays Code came in, they already knew that James Joyce's Ulysses and stuff like that was going to become a matter of contest, and then that ended that old regime of censorship. But then, interestingly enough, the thing that was important in the movies was the thing that became the thing under moral scrutiny, and then you had that Fair Media Act, or how's they called it, with respect to the radio, which lasted from like the mid 40s or so until Ronald Coase put an end to that with saying let's just free it up to the markets instead. But we could project back further than that, and I just wanted to give sort of a gloss of the American situation. Is that one, it's very complex, and it seems to me there's probably scholars saying all kinds of things, but it's sort of like what is the free, obviously de facto, just as in the First Amendment, just as in the freedom of expression not supposed to be abridged by the First Amendment, and the freedom of the press. We also have the two clauses on religion, but we could see de facto, it's like in 3 states were Congregationalist, and then a bunch of states were in the South were like Church of England, and in, I guess, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, I think, were all Congregationalist, and that went on even to, in one case, beyond 1830. So then there could be, what the problem is, then there could be a long question of what did the majority of the founders in the beginning, even though they knew there's this de facto situation, which would be resistant to actually hold to that principle, and what's the real situation there. But the same thing with free speech. We could see like the argument against that, which I'm more think makes more sense, is that it was the question of whether the federal power could tell the states what to do with respect to both religion and speech. But the states themselves had the right to censorship, which they often exercised, and the right to, and which they, of course, it's raging today. There's huge censorship today, right? Because, and I'm not talking about the way Twitter was censored. That's also yet another factor, the way Musk came in and changed the culture of Twitter to make it, I suppose, to me it seems freer, but I guess the existence of the other platform that so many progressives and leftists have gone away from, had left X, canceled their X accounts and trying to go to this other, I forget what it's called, but there's another sort of Twitter or X-like app. But so that would indicate that a lot of people are unhappy with the new regime, but maybe it's just that it was less, it allowed more right-wing voices to some extent, which isn't obviously, that draws a lot of questions about whether there's a neutral point or not, I guess, to my mind. But in any case, what I was thinking of is the, especially in Florida and Texas, all the laws against wokeism or LGBTQ plus type of books, especially in the question of that they would, the safeguarding and protection, they don't say of faith and morals, but they say of children and in the schools or something like that, But it sort of tags along with that. Historically in the West, we could say there's censorship wasn't always that big of a deal because before the time of the Gutenberg press, before the time of the printing press and the large dissemination of books, there were the Catholic Church's fight against heresies was probably the biggest form of censorship. But then that kept changing and changing from century to century until I think in some way the Catholic Church had to, in a way, capitulate under the explosion of media, and of course already long before the internet. I think it was not really possible to maintain the kind of careful, guarded censorship, which is, let me say, I have a little quote about how they understood that. This is just something from the old Catholic encyclopedia from, I can't remember the year, it's like 1906 or something. The better the author is known as an Orthodox Catholic, the greater his reputation as a writer, the more easily will his work influence and mislead the unsuspecting. In these and similar cases, though the savant may have acted in good faith and written his book with the best of intentions. So the church is very anxious to guard against any errors which would affect human morals. And therefore this could come from a misunderstanding about the Trinity. It could come from all the normal suspects, right? So yeah, we could build, so the one can already, I think, from this sort of construct a body of tropes and phrases and epithets and micro-races and whatever, and put together a horde of things effective of the human docile, which might need to be censored because they come through a linguistic form. So we have this statement. So that, I mean, that much on this, how broad this subject is. We had a statement on Essay Delendum podcast on the first Kirk Kimmel post at the time of Kimmel being canceled, where somebody calling themselves American Quaterus 18 wrote, you can yell fire in all caps in a theater. You can do it tomorrow. Now don't be surprised if people start beating your butt, and bad if it's a lie. Freedom of speech, freedom of consequence, exclamation. So, I mean, I think that links up to the Socrates example, and then we should point out that when Leo Strauss says liberalism in a way stands or falls on the right to lie or free speech, this was not a right that Socrates enjoyed. His contemporaries could vote to have him executed for misusing speech. He didn't have simply carte blanche with respect to speech, and there wasn't the protection that we're now getting put forward as part of the American underlying principles. So then I want to try to locate exactly when did this suddenly become part of the American underlying principles, such that Ted Cruz. So I was looking at I'm kind of a day late here, but I looked at the monologue of Jimmy Kimmel on his comeback, and he cited Ted Cruz to say, I it's something like, I hate everything about Jimmy Kimmel. I'm glad that he was fired, but, and then he goes into a spiel about what he no doubt learned in Harvard Law in the early 90s when he went, which was right after the 89 case where I tried to give, I'll paste in the notes of this the full statement of what Kennedy said, and the full trope is sort of like this. It's like some guy who had gone through some kind of, I don't know if it was a POW camp or if it was a death camp or what, but he was in World War II, and he had knit together this bear flag with a little bit of red, white, and blue string, and he was aghast at this 1989 finding that it's a form of speech to burn the flag. That was all about. The thing was really about anti-war protests, pretty much, and it had followed on Vietnam era protests, and so the burning of the flag really for this guy who did it, who Kennedy says, he actually says he was no philosopher, and he may not have comprehended the I can't remember the repugnance of which he caused with this, or how repulsive, but repellent, how repellent this is to the good Americans, or something like this. But then in the same way, Kennedy basically says, and then this guy this was the father of somebody who then came in to Kennedy when he was in some club, which turned out to be a segregationist club, actually, and that Kennedy had to shamefacedly bow out of when he was in his confirmation hearings to get on the Supreme Court, and say, I have nothing to do with this type of people that do segregation in their private clubs. But that's another issue of free speech and the right of who to hang out with is also part of this 1964 Civil Rights Act, which Charlie Kirk was on about. But what's really the locus? But anyway, let me finish the anecdote. The guy comes and says, how could you do this? My father who made this flag, and blah, blah, blah. And then Kennedy says, well, won't you give him what I said in the decision? And then he gives him what he said in the decision. And then it's this beautiful moment. The father reads the decision, and he says, yes, you can be proud to be an American now, or whatever, I understand. And so it's like not only Ted Cruz, but also Tucker Carlson, also all the big right-wing pundits. Who's the guy that's always saying facts don't care about your feelings? Ben Shapiro. Everyone came out and congratulated themselves on their free speech bona fides. But this, what I would say is, this really wouldn't have been the case in 1964. This wasn't the case, and this wasn't the case much longer, really. And I think the beginning of it is that 1989 finding that this became suddenly this is a profiles of courage issue. Suddenly this is a swearing on the Bible thing. It's like this, and then the principal noted. I'll put the full statement in the notes on the video, but let me read some of the things that Kennedy said. He said, the hard fact is that sometimes we must make decisions we do not like. So in other words, he's saying we're deciding to let this guy burn the flag, which is the symbol of the military and the symbol of the country, and actually the symbol of the very value of free speech itself. But we have to pay this price of allowing the enemies of freedom some freedom, something like that. The flag burning case reminds us that freedom is not free. It costs us something to defend the right to burn it. But that's the price of liberty. It is poignant but fundamental that the flag protects those who hold it in contempt. So even Scalia came out with statements of a similar kind, and when Scalia was challenged by, it's almost like watching, when Putin is addressed by, some farmer from the rural area, from the vast rural areas of the country, some modest question or whatever. It's when you hear these Supreme Court justices, the way they fed the questions, it's like you get some, first-year law student comes out and says, "Please, sir, could you give me an example of a time when you had to make a hard decision and when you stuck to your guns or something?" And then Scalia's like, "Ha ha ha! But you see, in the Scalia house, we hate the fact of burning the flag, but this is what the text of the Constitution demanded," or whatever. So I think the problem with, so Roberts brought this out, and I think it makes some sense, is just from the, let me just say something from the legalistic point of view. We've come to a situation where there's kind of a, people no longer stand on principle anywhere in vicinity to the political thing, or in the Beltway, or in whatever, in the following sense. So, for instance, Barry Goldwater came out against the 1964 Civil Rights Act for the reason that basically he thought, I think he basically thought it was the states' rights issue, that the states should handle things like employment and right to associate, and the housing discrimination issues, and that it was an overstep to make the federal authority and the Constitution to do that, and that wasn't the intent of the Constitution, something like that. But then he said, if I'm holding office, then I have to do what the court says, and I'll go along with that. But he put a lot of emphasis on the fact that he had to he had to decide on the principle of what he thought was right himself, and then there was going to be this constant cognitive dissonance, and that's unavoidable between what the Constitution seems to be. So James Wilson said was one of the first to make this phrase that you have to say what the law is, not what it ought to be. But he understood that to mean something more like what the law is will be revealed somehow in the fullness of time, or something like that, and especially through the precedents, which I think Roberts still said in his confirmation hearing that he holds by the law of precedents rather than by Scalia's. Well, obviously I have a bias against his stupid textualism, which just really means he gets to decide whatever he wants ad hoc, because he said, "Oh, this must be how they understood it at the time." Was there some case where he kept repeating the stupid phrase, legislative means legislative or something. They're asking what counts as the legislature means legislature. They're kind of, and then the text obviously says, to my mind, the text obviously says there's legislative powers. But then you have to but then that's not a common phrase. It's a legal phrase. It's a technical phrase, and it was a technical phrase at the time. So then looking at ordinary dictionaries isn't going to help you do that, and blah blah blah. But long and short of it is, the textualist way is kind of a dodge against actually understanding what the text wants, but it's also, in a worser way, it's a dodge about saying what the law is, because it means the judges, instead of acting like Barry Goldwater and saying, "This is what I really think the law is," instead Scalia acts as though what the law is somehow in the commonplace understanding of people at the time, which hadn't had 200 years of working it out through precedents, through actual cases, through casuistry. So I think Scalia's way is obviously a nonsensical innovation, but the actual tension in the matter is that whether or not saying what the law is to say there is something that is according to reason here. There is something that you can't say nihil est quod contra rationem estolicitum, nothing that is against reason is lawful. And this is the Hobbesian question. So like Hobbes says as often as reason is against a man, man will be against reason. And then he tries to solve the question not by finding people that have a sense of honor with respect to reasoning, which is the old way, but rather by building institutions which, through some kind of mechanisms, force men into a track where they can't make errors and make them into, in effect, these Entzauberung or demagicified, robbed of reason automatons. That's a Hobbesian solution, which is more, when you get all these problems about people saying, well, everything I just said with respect to Scalia trying to solve it through his textualism or whatever, through his originalism. But, okay, that's one angle on the question, but let me try to explode it too. So we had in the Kimmel thing again, there was like, what did he say in the I think Kimmel struck me as sort of, we shouldn't make a mistake about Kimmel. He's not really a comedian. So it's like we call him a comedian, but it's like comedians, there's one side of comedians, what they do is boast, but boasting is in a tragic register the same thing as hubris. But what is he really? He's really more like sort of a John Wayne type of figure, but for the Californians. I think I'm a Californian myself. He has the same attitude as Tom Hanks, somebody like that. Hollywood, California attitude. But we shouldn't make a mistake. He's a very overbearing figure in a lot of ways. And when he gives his monologue, it's not... So people criticize him on the right and say, oh, he has no talent or whatever. And so that could just be an insult. But I think some of them actually seriously believe it. But what they miss is what he's saying is actually meant to be very serious. It's deadly serious what he's saying. He's making an argument. He's constantly presenting an argument to the largest popular audience where he's making references to things like saying that Ted Cruz is Gargamel on the Smurfs show, and basically like that he's Papa Smurf. And I mean, that's a children's show. It's very well known in America, et cetera, et cetera. He makes a lot of he speaks to the largest popular audience, and it's not really that it's a comic speech. It's more like there's a few jokes interspersed, but the main essence of it is a political statement. So then this question of free speech takes a different light I think, doesn't it, in the light of all these different questions of media, dissemination of information. So one thing I would say that I kind of take objection to in the way he argues is that he argues so much to the demotic that it means that he says he's compelled to say things that don't really make sense, such as he said, some German guy offered me a job when I was fired by Disney. Come uns, come to us, and but isn't that something that even the Germans think we're too authoritarian out here in America? But then he doesn't bother to mention that Germany has radically changed in its character since the time of World War II, and in what sense is German authoritarian? And just in the sense that people like to keep appointments on time. That's true, but it's like a watchmaker's culture. It's like it's like the thing that Pushkin described in his Queen of Spades. It's like this culture that's obsessed with the timetables of the trains. But is that authoritarian? No. It's like it's a culture also where men urinate sitting down. So there's something misleading what I'm saying is there's something misleading in arguing to the most commonplace opinions without correcting them, or without, if they're not susceptible of correction, because somebody would say that's authoritarian to correct things. But let's say bringing out that there could be something wrong with this statement in the light of the fact that it's sort of a statement that's come into the popular possession about something that most people have not really thought about. It's like a thought, like plaque in the neuronal structure of the people that hasn't been it's become a brittle museum piece that's not alive anymore. It's not in contact with the reality of what Germany's like today. But so things like that, the fact that he's talking to the widest popular audience means that he's not going to make those corrections, and then it means that his speech is all the more dangerous. They bring this out in the tones of somebody that's criticizing free speech, and the question of whether our intellectual morals are being degraded by allowing this kind of thing. But so then we see it. Everyone on the right and the left, all these big pundits are coming out and immediately acting as though this was the underlying unity of the country hung on the question of free speech, and that it was obvious and that it didn't require any long inquiry into it to see whether it was true or not, or whether it was the real value of the country, and in fact whether it's even ever in the whole history of the country been maintained. It's obviously there's always the question of what to teach in schools. There's always a question of what can be promulgated broadly. There's always a question of when does something like Alex Jones, who gets people to go into pizza parlors and with guns and say, show me where Hillary Clinton is abusing these small children in the back room, and then Alex Jones says, well, but it was the wrong pizza parlor, and go out there and find the other ones. When does this slide into a Rwanda situation where the pundit is saying these are the enemy of the people, and these are the cockroaches, and they go out there and exterminate them, and then actual people take action on it? When is the slippery slope reach its point of no return, or when does it into the point where there must be this so-called intervention into the how did they put it, into the spread of the disinformation campaign, and of course, which is made almost worse by the fact that the people spreading the disinformation might believe their own propaganda, and in a certain way be unable to check themselves, because there's this how would free speech be argued for? In a way, it would be argued for, I think, the most common way is always to say you have something like sunlight is the best disinfectant. You have something like that there's a wisdom in crowds. You have some kind of magic. So there's some kind of things which, on cool reflection, are obviously magical thinking, even though there's some like hired guns that make arguments. There's some guys going around doing internet talks about them. But other than that, they're magical thinking, but yet we're still pressing them. And at the same time, I think free speech, there's not even any time when it could be even possible that there could be something like free speech, except that there's something in the Durkheimian sense that a culture has the same, a kind of inner logical agreement about what makes sense, such that everybody, without thinking about it, thinks in the same way, such that the categories by which men think is the same. The newer people in sub-Saharan Africa didn't have the word time, so they couldn't talk a lot about time or the divisions of time, about chronology, about clock time. They thought differently. They could say something like 3 sleeps ago there was some animal down by the water pool or something, but they didn't talk about time. Their logical categories for thinking were different than ours are, and then that enforces a uniformity of thought which isn't noticed broadly. So there's that, but once you notice it, how can it not become contested as a matter of sort of dangerous speech that makes one inhuman? So one side, I think that's what I want to say from the larger perspective. The other side of this is the question of insanity, which Socrates had already raised in the beginning of the polity or republic. So this question of whether there's such a thing as diminished capacity comes in. And diminished capacity seems to be a question is large. When does it begin? When does somebody have diminished capacity? When does somebody have to be suppressed by law or relinquish some of their rights or have their rights abrogated? Is as large a question as the free speech question, but how much can it be made to rage over the country? So let's look at the material situation with regard to, let's start with 1964. So the material situation was basically, during the Civil Rights Act, the problem with spreading some kind of Hayekian local market system was the South culturally did not want this so-called this thing that was then announced as an underlying principle of American values of a color-free society to come in. There was, the Ferguson decision in 1896, and then the Brown versus Board of Education, which I think is it as late as 1957, or was it already in? No, okay. So I guess in 47 and 48, you had the baseball and then the military integrated. Earlier on in World War I or whatever, there would have been too much violent opposition to that. But so you had a bunch of things happening that were pushing towards the demand for both this sort of housing and employment equal rights that the 1964 Civil Rights Act demanded, but you had monopolies on, you had monopolies on electricity, on oil, on the infrastructure that was necessary to run businesses, so that what happened is there was a rise of sort of national businesses, but most of them got in this situation where the small businesses, they couldn't go down to the South and hire a black guy at the same rate that they pay a white guy, because their power and their oil and their the whole community would turn against them. Maybe not the whole community, but the state apparatus would turn against them. And so there was this question of sort of, once you have the Civil Rights Act, then you can go declare these pernicious monopolies and then settle the question that way. Break the cultural stronghold of the mores in that way. And that was a big reason for bringing in these things that are the forerunners of the diversity, equity, inclusion. And in fact, that's one example of it, breaking down the monopolies, which, because they were run by people that were for segregation, who cared more about that than they cared about the supposed advantages and efficiency of a free market, that they weren't going to end their monopolies. The government held monopolies on energy, on fuel, and on some other things. So that was one big issue, which is a concrete issue. And then there were some statements like, about these being fundamental American values, and one can see sort of in the light of the old censorship, which would say, let's throw in another theme. From the beginning of political thinking in the West, from Plato, you have this question of whether political power is ultimately military power. And so that's playing out also in the Germany situation with the Red Line dilemma, or whether political power is something else. People fall into a kind of murky, useless attitude, I think, if we just say that everything that happens in the city is political, because political is just like an adjective describing the polis or the city. But if you give it any special region, That's the political. Then it would seem military is one reason, and then we had things like the Sedition Act around World War I. But people were largely, I guess, both people were largely compliant in a larger way. I think because one, conditions were more brutal, physically more brutal, and two, there was less means for mass communication, and then maybe the distant three, I would say people are less educated, but I don't think that's the main issue is the education. I think it's more the ability of people to talk across large areas. But then by World War II, yeah, you're already at the foot at this moment when the idea of burning the flag and the idea of, this idea that actually being directly seditious, directly against the country, directly against the war effort. Let me throw another thing in. The old Roman idea of the cult of the capital. Capital is spelled with an O. They're on the Capitine Hill, and if you don't swear allegiance to the gods of the Romans, that means exactly the same thing as that you're not going to go to war with the Romans. And if you're not going to go to the war with the Romans, then you're not a Roman. But at some point, that becomes a question. People say, no, I'm a private citizen. I'm not going to war isn't really my thing. Mar-a-Lago, hanging out on the golf course is my thing. So when you get the cult of the capital ends, then the idea of sedition sort of starts to fall away. Then the idea of free speech sort of begins towards this Kennedy meaning, which I'll put in the notes as I keep saying. And that's the current underlying unity of all these people that come out and say they're Tucker Carlson with this idiotic statement that he's a free speech absolutist. Which can't possibly, what can that possibly mean? People can have the right to tell any lie they want and to dox anyone they want and to divulge any secret that will to tell somebody lies that will get them killed, and to incite violence. And it's easy to say, there's a few carve-outs to that, but then it's hard in practice to show exactly where they end. That's my attempt to kind of throw this Kimmel thing back into the fundamental Platonic philosophy, into the fundamental questions that were already kind of stirred up and constantly menacing the ancient Greeks, but which have for us fallen into what Kimmel calls the blasé attitude, which I think is even worse than the sort of problem that when Weber talks about the so-called Entzauberung, or the usually translated as the disenchantment. Zauber is the same word Mozart uses in the Magic Flute. That he's thinking more of the deep state and what became the deep state, entrenched bureaucratic cultures, which are meant to have technical capacities, technical proficiencies, which are free from the political sphere. I mean, you could look at politics as the place where technical proficiency ends. That would be a wide way to look at it, but that would be the same as saying politics is the region of the subjective. I wouldn't be too much at ease with putting it that way, but I'm just saying all these different ways to analyze the situation are suggest themselves somehow out of the subject matter when you just sort of talk about it and think it over, which amount to the same thing. Is there anything more that I want to connect to that? Well, hopefully we'll get some more comments to stimulate further looks at this stuff.